The next 3 steps are learning to read emotions in other people, learning to read emotions in oneself, and practice. Did you have a chance to do the homework?
Yeah, I did it. I got it here. Want to see it?
Well, it looks like you came up with quite a number of words. Why don't you read them to me?
Stressed, pressured, annoyed, pissed off, burned out, overwhelmed, apprehensive, burdened, heavy, worried, resentful, furious, zapped, happy, depleted, pissed off, uneasy, disturbed, pleased, disappointed.
Wow, that's quite a list, quite a number of words. Were you surprised that you came up with so many words for emotions?
Yes, I was. Stress was easy, pressure was easy, and next thing you know, I got rolling there.
Yeah,
I did it 3 different times.
You 3 different times you sat down to write down the words.
Yeah. I just noticed here, I didn't realize this pissed off I put on here twice. But
Well, that's okay. We'll give you credit for both of them.
Right.
Well, I noticed that a number of the words really related to symptoms of stress, which is not at all surprising, given what you told me last week, that you are under a lot of stress and you carry a lot of burdens. So you have words like stressed, overwhelmed, sapped, depleted, things like that. I also noticed that you had a number of words for anger. Again, this is kind of consistent with what you told me about your experience, so your vocabulary seems to kind of relate fairly well to your experience. You have words like furious, pissed, resentful, annoyed. You have fewer words for what I call the vulnerable emotions. I think you have disappointment on there, and do you have worried?
I have both, disappointed and worried.
Disappointed and worried. So you have a couple of words, and maybe a few more, for the vulnerable emotions, which are the emotions that I think make us feel vulnerable, like sadness and fear, disappointment and hurt. And you had a few emotions, for the kind of the happy end of the spectrum. I think you said happy and pleased, but not a lot of words about caring, like affection and fondness and such like that.
All right.
So this probably, too, reflects the work we need to do, that your vocabulary is a reflection of the kind of words you commonly use to describe your experience, and as your experience grows, you'll have more words. I would encourage you to keep that up, maybe, to continue to try to add words to your list, and maybe think about the vulnerable end of the spectrum as well as the caring end of the spectrum.
Vulnerable, you mean?
Well, words that make
example.
you feel vulnerable, like sad. Sad is a word that usually makes a man feel pretty vulnerable, or fear,
Okay.
or hurt, or lonely, or abandoned, things like that. So those are what I call vulnerable emotions, those kinds of things.
Right, okay.
Now, I thought what we might want to do is kind of return to some of the things you talked about briefly in the first session, Raymond. You had mentioned, initially that, your father kind of may represent a sort of a hot button for you, and I'd like to get a little bit more information about your father. Could you tell me a bit about him?
Good man. Hard-working man. Kind of the strong, silent type. Did his job, took care of the family. I admired him. I respected him.
What kind of work did he do?
My dad was a publisher. He started a newspaper in Minnesota when we moved there, and built it. Built the business, built the paper. Worked a lot, busy. Not real talkative. I mean,
Man of few words.
Man of few words. There were times I didn't see a whole lot of him. Not because he didn't want to be. I don't know. He was working, is basically it. People would come over to the house, the sheriff or the councilman or whatever, because in that community that kind of revolved around the newspaper. So obviously my father being the publisher.
So he was home, but you wouldn't get to see him because he'd be busy with other people?
I guess he's what you'd call a newspaper man in the old style. And he lived his newspaper and spent a lot of time on it. if he had an interest, it was World War II. I mean, he was...
World War II.
He used to talk about that probably with the same energy he talked about doing his newspaper. And I guess that time in his life was a heightened experience. He used the expression, hanging in the butt end of a bomber. And with these flyers flying around.
What did that mean, hanging in the butt of a bomber?
Basically, he's back there with a machine gun. These enemy planes are flying around, and he's trying to shoot them down. And I mean, when he talks about that, he talks about an experience that I can only somehow imagine. When he would talk about the war and his experiences in it, he'd have a sense of his eyes would light up. I think as almost as if he were back there. And I sometimes think he wished he was back there. You know, it wasn't like he said, I don't want to be here. I'm sure he loved my mother. And I guess he was a good father. I mean, we were raised. We had food on the table.
How close did you feel to him as your father?
Well, my dad's not a guy you get close to. So we didn't have like a close buddy, go to the ball game kind of relationship. He did his job. He provided for the family, but just wasn't that. He wasn't a warm guy, kind of. I respected him, you know, but I wouldn't say close, but not because we had a problem between us. He just wasn't someone you get close to.
I get you.
Anyway, that was him.
Yeah. I pursued this line of inquiry about his father's unavailability and emotional remoteness because in the first session he demonstrated a level of reactivity that indicated that these issues were somewhat accessible. As with many of the men I counsel, he was much more sealed off about his mother. We're running close to the end of the session. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the homework assignment for next week. Basically, as you know, we're working on developing emotional skills, and we're going to build on the exercise you did this last week of identifying vocabulary words for emotions. And we're pointing toward the goal of being able to identify your own emotions. But I found that there's a very helpful intermediate step, and that is to learn to identify the emotions in other people. Now, this could be people that you're interacting with or people that you see on TV or in a movie. The idea is to try to infer from their tone of voice, from their facial expressions, you know, from the way they're carrying their body, what it is that they're feeling. We have now begun the second step of the four-step psychoeducational program, learning to identify emotions in other people. I provide didactic instruction on how to read nonverbal communication and teach Raymond to build on what is natural for many men, what I call action empathy, to develop emotional empathy. Basically, what I'm building on here is a strength that I think a lot of men have, and that is of being able to sort of see things from another person's perspective. We don't often tune into the emotional level. In fact, we're very good, I think, at sort of seeing things from another person's point of view and figuring out what they're going to do. That makes us very good in business and sports and that sort of thing. In fact, I call this action empathy as contrasted with emotional empathy, which I think is more easy for women.
I'm not sure I'm clear on the difference between action, empathy, and I don't think I know what either one is. So,
okay.
Exactly.
Well, empathy is the ability to see things from another person's perspective and show them that you see it. But because of the way in which we are socialized, which we've talked about before, we tend to emphasize the realm of doing things, and we're shunted away from the realm of feeling about things. And the opposite is true for females, who are socialized to be very aware of feelings. So males and females develop on separate tracks, and we both develop the skill of empathy, but in different ways. Our skill is to kind of is to see another person's perspective and figure out how they're likely to respond. But by learning this to apply emotion words, you're going to be building on your skill in action empathy to develop emotional empathy.